If a man rejects you, don't chase, don't beg, don't shrink. Just pause, because something deeper is happening under the surface. Something about you, about him, about what you're really needing, and most of all, about what you're finally ready to stop pretending isn't hurting. You feel it before it even happens, that slow pullback, the way he goes silent in the middle of what used to feel warm. You overanalyze a word he said or didn't say. You reread the last message. You stare at your phone, hoping, bargaining with the universe, trying not to be too much or too little. And when the rejection comes, whether it's quiet or cruel, it hits something ancient in you. But this is not just about him. Maybe you've given more than you had to give. Again, maybe you became small so he would feel big. Maybe you twisted your softness into silence because you thought love meant being easy to love. Maybe no one told you, ever, that real love won't ask you to bleed just to be seen. And now, here you are, rejected, but still here, breathing, and maybe for the first time, ready to stop abandoning yourself for someone who wasn't even holding you. This is not about learning tricks to make him want you back. This isn't about becoming irresistible, magnetic, healed overnight. That's noise. This is about peeling back the quiet grief that rises in your chest when you whisper, "Why not me?" This is about looking in the mirror and realizing he didn't reject you. He rejected the version of you that was performing safety. And maybe that version wasn't even really you. We carry our wounds into love, like shadows. We chase unavailable people because we think love is proving we're worth staying for. We overgive because we think if we are generous enough, calm enough, quiet enough, we'll finally be chosen. But what if this pain is not punishment? What if it's permission? What if this rejection is your body whispering, "Don't go back to shrinking"? In this video, we'll walk through the unraveling, not the kind that breaks you, but the kind that brings you home. We'll reflect on the deeper truth Carl Jung pointed toward when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This isn't theory. This is you, your patterns, your tenderness, your remembering. And if you've ever felt like love has to hurt to be real, or that being chosen means disappearing, then I made this for you. Not for everyone, just you. Like I'm sitting across from you, like I've been where you are. If something in you is already starting to breathe differently, stay. You're not broken. You're just waking up. If this speaks to your heart, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because if this story touches you, chances are it will touch someone else too. Someone you might never meet, but someone just as tired of being unseen. Take a breath. Now let's begin. There was a woman I knew once. She would never call herself brave. In fact, she spent most of her life believing she was weak, too emotional, too needy, too sensitive. She met a man who made her feel seen in a way that caught her off guard. Not all at once, not in a fairy tale way. It was more subtle, more intoxicating. He listened. He asked about her childhood. He looked her in the eye when she spoke, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was being held not physically, but emotionally. So she opened. She unfolded parts of herself that had been locked away. She shared stories she had never said aloud. And slowly, quietly, she began to hope. But hope has a sharp edge when you've been hurt before. One day, something shifted. He didn't say it with words, but she felt it. His responses got shorter. He stopped asking questions. His warmth cooled, and her stomach started knotting before his name even lit up on her phone. You know that feeling? That space between stillness and storm? She lived there for days. Then the rejection came. He told her he wasn't ready, that she was incredible, but he just couldn't give her what she deserved. She nodded, said she understood, but inside, something caved in, not because he left, but because it felt like a confirmation, a message she'd heard all her life in whispers. You're too much. You're not enough. You're unlovable. She cried that night, but not just for him. She cried for the younger version of herself, the one who used to sit alone in her room, wondering why she felt invisible. She cried for the years she spent bending so far backward for love that she lost her spine. And when she woke up the next morning, swollen-eyed and silent, she didn't reach for her phone. She reached for herself. That's when the real journey began. When a man rejects you, it can feel like everything breaks. But it's often the moment something inside finally wakes up. It's not just the pain of the moment. It's the echo, the reverberation of every time someone made you feel disposable. The father who never noticed your sadness. The friend who only came around when they needed something. The boyfriend who loved your light, but resented your shadows. That's the wound that gets triggered. Carl Jung didn't write love songs, but he did write about the soul. He believed we all carry parts of ourselves we don't want to look at, forgotten, exiled, denied. And the people we fall for, they bring those parts to the surface. They don't create our pain, they reveal it. So when you feel rejected, it's not because you weren't good enough. It's because someone brushed against your most tender places, then turned away. And now those places are exposed, aching, loud. What do you do with that? You stop looking for another person to soothe it. You sit with it. You hold yourself the way you wish someone had held you. You ask yourself, where else have I felt this? And you don't run from the answer. The woman I told you about, she didn't bounce back right away. She didn't go to yoga or journal it out in one night. She broke a little, but she also began to rebuild, slowly, not around him, but around herself. That's the invitation rejection offers. Not to chase, not to harden, but to return. Return to the part of you that was always worthy of love, even when no one saw it. Return to the version of you that doesn't beg to be chosen because she knows she already is, by herself. And in the quiet, when she finally stopped asking why he left, she heard a different question rising from deep inside. Why do I keep leaving myself? That's when the real healing begins. There's something about the silence after rejection that feels louder than any argument could. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful, the kind that sits in your chest like a weight, like an unanswered question. You find yourself replaying everything, wondering if it was the moment you laughed too loudly, or the time you got too vulnerable too soon. You ask yourself if maybe you misread the signs, if maybe you wanted too much, and slowly, the rejection stops being about him and starts becoming a weapon you turn against yourself. But here's the truth no one tells you when you're in the middle of that spiral. This pain isn't new. It didn't start with him. It's ancient, and the reason it hurts so deeply is because it reopens a wound that never fully healed. There's a part of you that learned early on to earn love, to be useful, likable, accommodating. Maybe you had to tiptoe around someone else's moods just to feel safe. Maybe love came with strings. Maybe every time you needed comfort, you were met with distance. And so now, when someone pulls away, that child inside of you thinks it's your fault. Because back then, it was easier to believe you were the problem than to accept that the people who were supposed to protect you didn't know how to love you right. But you're not that child anymore. That's where the shift begins. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the part of us we disown, hide, repress, and often, the shadow isn't something dark or dangerous. It's just the part of us that feels unworthy, too needy, too intense, too soft. too real. And when someone walks away from us, it's not just their absence that hurts. It's the feeling that they saw our shadow and didn't stay. But what if their leaving wasn't rejection at all? What if it was a mirror? A mirror showing you the very place inside where your love has never fully landed. That part of you, the one who's been holding her breath, waiting to be accepted, is still there. She's been waiting a long time for you to turn toward her instead of against her. To say, I see you, I hear you, you're safe now. Because if you can learn to hold that version of yourself with the same tenderness you offer others, something shifts. You stop trying to fix yourself to keep love. You stop treating rejection like a verdict. You stop begging to be seen, and you start choosing to see yourself. The woman I told you about? She used to measure her worth by the way men responded to her. If he texted, she felt beautiful. If he didn't, she felt invisible. And she hated that. She hated how easily her joy got hijacked by someone else's attention. But she didn't know how to break the cycle. Until she started listening to her own silence. She stopped running to prove she was enough, and started sitting in the discomfort of her own company, not to punish herself, but to remember what it felt like to belong to herself. That's the paradox of healing. You stop chasing people who reject you, not because you don't care anymore, but because you finally care enough about yourself. You learn to differentiate between love and longing, between desire and self-abandonment, between being wanted and being valued. And slowly, the man who once held so much power over your sense of self begins to shrink in your memory, not because you erased him, but because you stopped making him the source of your worth. He was a chapter, not your whole story. And maybe the most painful part of healing is accepting that some people were only meant to show you the wound, not to stay long enough to help you heal it. But maybe that's sacred too, because now you're the one doing the healing, and that is where your power lives. Some nights, she still thought of him, not out of longing anymore, but out of recognition, like looking at an old photograph of someone who once made your world flicker. A version of her used to live for those flickers. She mistook them for fire, mistook attention for affection, mistook temporary presence for permanent love. But now, she could see the difference. He didn't break her. He revealed where she was still bleeding. And that hurt, but it also helped. Because in the weeks after he left, she had to face something more frightening than his absence, her own emptiness. That place inside that had never truly been held, not by anyone, not even by herself. There's a moment in healing that no one prepares you for. The part where you stop blaming them and start grieving you. Grieving all the versions of yourself who smiled when she wanted to scream, who said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, who stayed when her soul was begging to leave, who wrapped her arms around someone who couldn't love her, just to feel a little less alone. She grieved them all. And in that grief, she found something else, something rare, something deeper than understanding. Compassion. Compassion for the woman who wanted so badly to be loved that she thought disappearing was the price. She didn't hate her, not anymore. She just promised never to leave her behind again. Carl Jung believed we meet ourselves in the other, that every relationship, especially the painful ones, reflects what we have yet to face within. It's not always romantic to think of love that way, but it is real. And when you're brave enough to look at heartbreak not as a loss but as a revelation, you begin to reclaim yourself. That's what she did. She stopped asking why he left and started asking why she stayed so long in places that required her to dim. She stopped asking what she did wrong and started asking what she believed about love that made her think she had to earn it. She stopped writing stories that ended with, "if only," and started writing new ones that began with, "even if." Because even if he hadn't left, she would have eventually had to face the truth. She was still starving for something she kept giving away to others. Validation, safety, warmth, home. But home isn't someone who chooses you. Home is how you choose yourself. And when you finally realize that, something shifts so quietly you almost miss it. You stop waking up hoping he'll text. You stop rehearsing what you would say if you ran into him. You stop building your value around his silence. You simply breathe, and in that breath, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from being accepted, but from no longer needing to be. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need closure. She didn't even need to understand his reasons. She only needed one thing, to walk herself home. And so, she did. One small choice at a time. The first time she laughed again, really laughed. It caught her by surprise. It wasn't performative, not a sound meant to make anyone like her more. It wasn't because someone said something charming. It came from somewhere deep, raw, almost wild, like a part of her spirit had remembered itself. And in that moment, she realized something beautiful had happened. She had stopped waiting for someone else to hand her joy. For so long she had been holding out hope that if she could just be good enough, soft enough, careful enough, someone would finally choose her and she could finally rest. But that was never rest. That was survival dressed up as love. And when she let that idea fall away, when she stopped looking outside herself for the feeling of being whole, everything changed. Not overnight. There were days when she still felt the ache, days when the loneliness returned like a fog, blurring her vision, but she no longer feared it. She no longer tried to outrun it. She sat with it, listened to it, let it pass through her instead of defining her. Because she was no longer trying to be invulnerable, she was learning to be true. And truth has a frequency that doesn't chase anything. It just is. Steady, soft, unshakable. Sometimes, healing isn't about fixing the wound. Sometimes, it's about recognizing that the wound is where the light enters, that the pain of being rejected by someone else brought her to the very place where she could finally stop rejecting herself. There was a time she would have given everything just to feel chosen. Now, she only wants what reflects the truth of who she is. Not a filtered version, not a watered-down version, not a version who molds herself into what a man wants. The full version, the one with history, with scars, with longing and laughter and fire. And that version, she's not waiting to be chosen. She's choosing. She's choosing what feels aligned, not what feels familiar. She's choosing connection, not confusion. Peace, not performance. Intimacy, not intensity. And when someone new enters her life, and they will, she will no longer twist herself into palatable shapes. She will no longer apologize for her fullness. She will no longer cling to the hope that she can love someone into staying, because she knows something sacred now. Not everyone who leaves is a loss. Some are liberations, and not every rejection is abandonment. Some are redirections. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." She didn't understand that before. Not really. She thought becoming meant doing, striving, proving. But now she knows it means returning, shedding the masks, the stories, the roles, coming home to the self beneath it all. And when you've lived a life trying to be enough, that homecoming is not small. It's everything. So when someone asks her now, what happened with him? She doesn't flinch. She doesn't turn bitter. She smiles gently and says, "He left, and I stayed." There's a sacred power in staying. Staying with yourself when everything in you wants to escape. Staying through the ache of not being chosen. Staying when your hands itch to text, to reach out, to prove you're still worthy. Staying not to wait for someone to come back, but to welcome yourself home. She used to think that strength meant moving on fast, that healing looked like glowing up, pretending it didn't hurt, being effortlessly unbothered. But that was just another costume. Another way of saying, please don't see how deeply I cared. Another way of performing control in a world that taught her vulnerability was weakness. But now she understands, real healing is quiet. It happens in the still moments when you resist the urge to make someone else the solution. It happens when you catch yourself romanticizing what was never real and you stop. It happens when you feel the old impulse rise, the need to prove you're lovable, and you breathe through it instead. She learned to do that. Slowly, tenderly. She started catching her own patterns mid-sentence, the way she'd soften her words so he wouldn't pull away, the way she'd censor her joy, her anger, her truth so she wouldn't be too much, the way she'd disappear behind a version of herself she thought he might love. And every time she noticed it, she didn't judge it. She just whispered, "Not anymore," because love, when it's real, doesn't require you to vanish. Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, and now she knew why. Because it meant saying goodbye to the fantasy. Goodbye to the illusion that if you just shapeshift perfectly, you'll be loved forever. It meant standing in the mirror and seeing yourself clearly, flaws, messiness, longing, and saying, even this, especially this, I choose you. It wasn't easy. Nothing sacred ever is. But something else began to shift. She stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy, stopped chasing the highs of being temporarily seen, stopped calling it love when it was actually survival. And slowly, life started reflecting her back to herself. The friends who truly listened, the mornings that felt soft again, the music that made her cry, not because she was broken, but because she was finally open. The man who rejected her, he didn't get the best of her. He got the version of her that was still learning how to stay. She thanks him, quietly sometimes, not because he was kind, not because he gave her closure, but because without his rejection, she may never have remembered the sound of her own voice. She may never have come back to the girl inside who used to wonder if she'd ever be enough. Now, she looks at that girl with eyes full of grace, full of protection, full of love. And when she feels the ache rise again, as it sometimes does, she doesn't panic. She places a hand on her heart and says, "We're not going anywhere." She is no longer afraid of rejection, because she no longer rejects herself. There's a kind of softness that only comes after the storm. Not weakness, not fragility, but the quiet strength of someone who has walked through the fire and no longer needs to prove they survived. She began to live differently, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but intentionally. She stopped responding out of fear, stopped saying yes when her body screamed no, stopped pretending confusion was chemistry. She noticed the way her body tensed when she sensed someone emotionally unavailable. It was familiar, almost magnetic. But now, instead of chasing it, she paused. She asked herself, what am I really drawn to here? And the answer wasn't love. It was the ache of being overlooked, the comfort of being unseen, because then she didn't have to risk being rejected again. But that pattern was old, and she was no longer willing to live by it. She once thought she had to prove she was lovable. Now she knew she was, and that knowing changed everything. She started to see men differently, not as saviors, not as validators, but as mirrors. Some reflected wounds, some reflected growth, but none of them were the source of her worth anymore. That shift was subtle, but powerful. It showed up when she could be vulnerable without crumbling, when she could hear a no and not internalize it as, "You're not enough," when she could feel desire rise and not let it override her discernment. She could finally hold the tension between wanting connection and honoring her own rhythm. And that tension, that space where she once used to abandon herself, became her place of power. She didn't become perfect. She became real. Carl Jung believed the soul longs for wholeness, not perfection. And in this slow reclamation, she was beginning to understand what that meant. Wholeness doesn't mean you never doubt yourself. It means you stop leaving yourself when doubt comes. It means you can sit with your younger self, the one who cried into her pillow, and say, "I see you now." It means you can look into the eyes of someone who doesn't choose you and still know you're not less. It means you no longer shrink to make others feel big. No longer silence your truth to keep the peace. No longer confuse your intuition with anxiety. And one day, as the sun was setting in her little apartment, light falling across the kitchen counter, she caught her reflection in the window. She didn't look different, but she felt a whole. There was no one next to her, no messages lighting up her phone, no promises being whispered into her ear, and yet she had never felt more loved. Because this time, the love wasn't coming from outside. It was hers. She had chosen herself, fully, finally, and that is something no rejection could ever take away. She used to think closure came from conversation, that if she could just hear the right words, an apology, an explanation, a confession of regret, then maybe her heart could settle. Maybe she could move on without the weight. But now, she knew, closure isn't given, it's claimed. You reach a point where the need for answers fades, not because the questions stop mattering, but because your peace matters more. She had spent so much of her life waiting for someone to realize what they had, waiting for someone to change, waiting for the pain to go away. But healing doesn't come from waiting. Healing comes from choosing, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. She chose not to text him when she missed him at night. She chose not to spiral when she saw him online, liking someone else's photo. She chose not to turn her love into a performance just to stay in the room. And in each choice, she built a new kind of self-respect. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, but doesn't lower its standards either. The kind that doesn't need to be seen by someone else to feel real. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Not your mind, not your fears, your heart." And when she looked into hers, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. She saw the girl who believed in magic, who loved deeply and gave freely, not because she was naive, but because that's who she was. She didn't lose that girl in rejection. She found her again, because now she wasn't loving from lack. She was loving from wholeness. And the next time someone showed up in her life, she didn't ask, "Will they stay?" She asked, "Do I feel safe being fully myself with them?" That's how you know you've healed. You stop begging to be chosen. You start choosing you over and over and over again. She still thinks about him sometimes. Not with pain, with gratitude. He left, and in his leaving she met herself. She forgave him not because he deserved it, but because she did. She stopped carrying the weight of his absence. She filled the space he left with laughter, with silence, with truth. And now, when someone walks into her life, they don't meet the girl who chases. They meet the woman who stays with herself first. She's not perfect. She's not above heartbreak, but she is whole. And that wholeness, it changes everything. There was a moment, much later, when love found her again. Not the kind she used to chase, not the roller coaster of almosts and maybes and emotional scarcity number. This time, it came quietly, without the firework illusions or the desperate hunger. It felt like standing barefoot in the morning sun, gentle, honest, unafraid. And in that moment, She understood what all the pain had been leading her toward, because she didn't flinch when he saw her fully. She didn't shrink when she spoke her truth. She didn't twist herself into someone more lovable. She just stood there as herself, fully, freely, unapologetically, and he stayed. Not because she performed, but because she no longer needed to. And whether he stayed forever or not, that was never the point. The point was, she stayed. That was the miracle. For so long, she thought being chosen by someone else was the destination. But now she knew. It was always about the journey back to herself. The journey through disappointment, through grief, through the unbearable ache of rejection, and into the fierce softness of self-recognition. This is the woman she became. She doesn't chase. She doesn't beg. She doesn't wait for breadcrumbs and call it dinner. She speaks. She rests. She remembers. And most of all, she lives not half alive, not performing, not clinging, but open, awake, rooted. She smiles at strangers now, sings in her car without worrying who's watching, sits in cafes alone, not lonely but alive, present. She isn't looking over her shoulder anymore, isn't measuring herself by someone else's gaze. She's here, really here. Sometimes she still gets quiet, still feels the tug of old ghosts. But now, she knows what to do. She doesn't run from the ache. She holds it, listens, breathes, because the wound isn't something to be ashamed of. It's proof of what she survived, proof of her capacity to love deeply, even when it cost her everything. Proof that she tried, that she opened, that she risked being seen, and now she knows. That's not weakness, that's strength. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But she's not terrified anymore. She's tender, she's fierce, she's free. So if you've been rejected, if your heart is still sore from someone who couldn't see your worth, know this. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of your return, the beginning of the quiet revolution inside you, the beginning of choosing yourself in a world that keeps asking you to forget. And when the ache comes again, and it will let it remind you, not of who left, but of how far you've come. Because the woman who rises from rejection, she doesn't beg to be seen. She is the light.